across the border from Nigeria. In Niger, a different kind of confrontation is brewing up. It's about the country's vast reserves of uranium and who gets to control it. Niger's junta have announced that they are putting their uranium from the Somaire mine on the open market. Somaire, once majority controlled by French nuclear giant Urano, was nationalised by the junta in June, stripping Urano of any control.
Uranium mining company is saying it's on the verge of bankruptcy. And this happens after Niger made it close to impossible for this company named Orano to continue exploiting their resources.
President Emerson Mnangagwa says Africa's natural resources will no longer be taken out of the continent without delivering real value to its people. Addressing journalists in Luanda after the 7th AU-EU summit, President Mnangagwa said African leaders are now firmly aligned in demanding fair and mutually beneficial partnerships, particularly in the mining sector, which remains central to Zimbabwe's economy.
The tension did not surface through sirens or emergency broadcasts. It crept into control rooms, policy briefings, and energy forecasts where assumptions had long gone unquestioned. Engineers noticed revised delivery schedules, energy planners flagged procurement gaps, analysts recalculated capacity margins that once felt comfortably secure. Then the realization spread. Africa had cut uranium supply, and France's nuclear backbone was suddenly exposed. For decades, France had built its energy identity on nuclear power. Reactors supplied the majority of electricity, anchoring industrial competitiveness and insulating households from volatile fossil fuel markets. This system depended not only on engineering expertise, but on steady access to uranium sourced largely from African partners. The arrangement had been treated as stable, almost permanent. Africa no longer treated it that way. The decision to restrict uranium exports did not arrive as a dramatic embargo. It emerged through revised licensing frameworks, domestic value retention policies, and new regional coordination among producing countries. The language emphasized sovereignty, fair pricing, and long-term development. The effect was immediate. Volumes tightened, timelines stretched, and negotiating leverage shifted. France felt the shock first. Procurement teams scrambled to assess reserves. Contracts that once renewed quietly were reopened under new terms. Spot markets offered limited relief at higher costs. The assumption that African uranium would always flow toward European reactors collapsed. Africa's calculus had changed. For years, uranium-rich countries had watched raw materials leave their borders while downstream value accrued elsewhere. Environmental burdens remained local, while pricing power stayed external. As global demand for strategic minerals intensified, the logic of exporting without leverage became harder to defend domestically. New policies reflected this shift. Export approvals were linked to domestic processing ambitions, infrastructure investment, and pricing mechanisms aligned with long-term national goals. Some countries prioritized regional partnerships, others reserved output for strategic allies willing to invest locally. The result was not uniform, but coordinated enough to alter global supply dynamics. France's energy planners confronted an uncomfortable reality. Nuclear plants, though domestically operated, were globally dependent. Fuel cycles stretched across continents. Any disruption upstream reverberated downstream. Even short-term supply uncertainty forced conservative operational decisions, reducing flexibility across the grid. The European Union took notice. France's nuclear fleet was not just a national asset. It was integral to regional energy stability. Power flows crossed borders. Any risk to French generation capacity translated into broader European vulnerability. Energy security discussions intensified, shifting from abstract resilience to concrete exposure. Public messaging remained calm. Officials emphasized preparedness, reserves, and diversification, yet behind closed doors. Contingency scenarios multiplied. What if restrictions tightened further? What if competition for alternative sources intensified? What if pricing volatility undermined long-term planning? Africa's position hardened with confidence. The decision was framed not as retaliation, but as recalibration. Uranium was strategic. Its extraction carried environmental and social costs. Exporting it cheaply while importing finished technology no longer aligned with development priorities. Control over supply was a lever, and Africa had learned how to use it. China and other emerging partners observed closely. Investment proposals accelerated, offers to build processing facilities, energy infrastructure, and technology partnerships gained traction. Africa's uranium was no longer just a commodity. It was a bargaining chip in a broader geopolitical game. France's reliance on predictability became a liability. Decades of stability had dulled risk awareness. Diversification had been discussed, but not urgently pursued. Now urgency arrived without warning. Markets reacted cautiously. Uranium prices edged upward. Long-term contracts were reassessed. Energy equities fluctuated as analysts priced in uncertainty. The sense of panic was contained, but palpable among those who understood the system's fragility. Africa's domestic discourse shifted. Citizens questioned why strategic resources should leave without corresponding benefits. Governments responded with policies designed to demonstrate control and foresight. Uranium joined a list of resources, now governed by strategic intent rather than legacy agreements. France's diplomatic channels activated. Engagement emphasized partnership, mutual benefit, and stability. Yet negotiating from a position of urgency weakened leverage. Africa's message was consistent. Access would be available, but on revised terms reflecting new realities. The nuclear question took on political weight. France's climate commitments relied heavily on nuclear power. Any perceived risk to plant operations complicated decarbonization strategies. The irony was stark. Clean energy goals depended on resources whose supply chains were anything but insulated. Africa's move resonated beyond uranium. It signaled a broader shift toward resource sovereignty. Other sectors watched closely. The lesson was clear. Coordination could reshape global dependencies long considered fixed. As the first phase unfolded, the panic in France was less about immediate shutdowns and more about uncertainty. Uncertainty about timelines, about costs, about control. Energy systems thrive on predictability. Africa's decision disrupted that. Predictability without firing a single shot. It demonstrated that influence in the modern world often flows not from force, but from the quiet power to say no or to say yes on new terms. And as Europe recalibrated its energy assumptions, one truth became unavoidable. The era of unquestioned access to strategic resources was ending, replaced by a world where suppliers, once overlooked, now set the pace. Once the initial shock of Africa's uranium supply cuts settled in, France and its European partners confronted a reality that could no longer be softened by diplomatic language or short-term fixes. The nuclear system that powered cities, industries, and entire national grids was built on assumptions that no longer held. France's nuclear plants were not designed for uncertainty. They were designed for continuity. For decades, uranium supply contracts had flowed predictably from African producers. The arrangements were long-term, stable, and rarely questioned. Uranium arrived, was processed, enriched, and fed into reactors that symbolized France's energy independence. That independence, however, depended on external sources remaining reliable. Africa changed that equation. The supply reductions were not framed as hostility. African governments emphasized sovereignty, value retention, and strategic resource management. Uranium, once treated as an export commodity, was reclassified as a national asset. New rules prioritized domestic processing, regional partnerships, and selective exports aligned with long-term interests. France faced immediate operational stress. Fuel reserves existed, but they were finite. Reactor schedules were adjusted. Maintenance outages were extended. Load balancing across the grid became more complex. While blackouts were avoided, margins narrowed dangerously. Europe felt the pressure spread. Countries connected to France's energy network depended on cross-border electricity flows. When French output dipped, prices surged across neighboring markets. Industrial users faced higher costs. Energy-intensive sectors reconsidered production plans. Africa's internal calculus deepened. Cutting uranium supply was not a symbolic gesture. It was part of a broader shift toward strategic resource governance. African countries hosting uranium reserves had watched for decades as raw materials left their borders with limited domestic benefit. Now, global demand for clean energy gave those resources new leverage. China and other emerging partners observed closely. Investment proposals multiplied. Processing facilities, research partnerships, and downstream industries were offered as alternatives to traditional extraction-only arrangements. Africa's position strengthened. As options expanded, France attempted diplomatic recalibration. High-level engagements emphasized partnership, shared history, and mutual benefit, yet the tone had changed. African counterparts spoke with confidence, not deference. Negotiations focused on terms, not access. The European Union scrambled for contingency planning. Alternative uranium sources were explored, but scaling new supply chains proved difficult. Regulatory approvals, environmental reviews, and geopolitical constraints slowed progress. The idea that uranium markets could be switched like gas pipelines proved naive. Public discourse in France shifted rapidly. Nuclear energy had long been presented as a shield against energy insecurity. Now that shield appeared cracked. Media debates questioned how independence could rely so heavily on external raw materials. Energy policy, once technical, became political. Africa's message remained consistent. This was not about punishment. It was about balance. Uranium exports would continue, but under frameworks that ensured local benefit, technology transfer, and long-term development. Access was no longer automatic. Europe's nuclear industry confronted structural exposure. Reactor fleets required predictable fuel cycles. Financial models assumed stable input costs. When those assumptions broke, risk assessments had to be rewritten. Insurance premiums rose. Investment hesitated. Africa's broader resource strategy gained momentum. Uranium was not isolated. Lithium, cobalt, and rare earths followed similar logic. The continent increasingly viewed strategic materials as leverage for development rather than commodities to be exhausted. France's panic was less about immediate collapse and more about trajectory. Energy planners understood that even temporary disruptions signaled a permanent shift. If Africa could coordinate uranium policy today, it could do the same tomorrow across other sectors. European diplomacy adjusted tone. Rather than demanding restoration, discussions moved toward partnership restructuring. Joint ventures, local processing, and shared value became central themes. The old model was no longer defensible. African public opinion supported the shift. Communities near uranium mines had long questioned the benefits of extraction. Environmental concerns, health impacts, and limited economic return fueled domestic pressure. Governments now framed supply control as both economic and moral responsibility. France's nuclear ambitions faced constraints. Plans to expand or extend reactor lifespans required confidence in fuel supply. That confidence weakened. Policymakers weighed diversification, renewables acceleration, and demand management more seriously than before. The crisis exposed asymmetry. Europe had energy technology but lacked resources. Africa had resources but had been excluded from value chains. The supply cut forced recognition of that imbalance. Global markets adjusted expectations. Uranium prices reacted. Long-term contracts were repriced. Investors factored geopolitical risk into nuclear projects worldwide. The perception of nuclear as insulated from global volatility faded. Africa's role in the energy transition became unavoidable. As the world pursued low-carbon power, control over critical inputs shifted influence southward. Africa was no longer peripheral to the energy future. It was central. France's panic matured into strategy. Emergency measures gave way to long-term planning. Diversification, diplomacy, and domestic debate reshaped policy. The shock forced realism. The second phase of the crisis revealed a deeper truth. Europe's energy security could not be separated from Africa's economic sovereignty. The era of assumed access was over. In its place stood negotiation, partnership, and shared risk. Africa's decision to cut uranium supply did not shut down Europe's nuclear plants overnight. It did something more consequential. It exposed a dependency that had been hidden behind decades of routine. And as Europe recalibrated under pressure, one message echoed clearly across capitals and markets alike. Control over critical resources had shifted, and the future of energy would be decided not only by technology but by who set the terms of access.